All right, everybody, if you can hear us, we've got Angie and her husband do some tech support stuff and get make the internet work over there. So we'll see. I think we're back. Yeah, we're back on. We're on Facebook. Let's see what else we got here. Live on YouTube. YouTube's telling me. I think we're back on Twitter as well, perhaps, maybe. Yeah, we're back there. So, and maybe LinkedIn. It's supposed to be. So, anyway, we're back. People are joining us, coming back, and sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody, but we got Angie back, so that's cool. So anyway, let's start over in case not all the same folks with us.
Okay.
But yeah, so the topic this evening is we're talking about Angie, who's up in Cleveland. I'm in Cincinnati, and we're talking about her new book, Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. And Angie, just touch again a little bit on your background, why it is that you were so passionate about this, some of your other writing for Streets Blog, et cetera, and how that all led to the point where you're now big time famous published author.
Yeah, I started writing this book about 2 years ago. Like, I had like an hour and a half of free time after work and after my kids went to bed. At the time, I had like a baby, pretty much a baby. But I was wasting a lot of time on social media, and I thought I should take that time, use it for something more productive, put all the stuff I've learned reporting at Streets Blog in a book. And I thought it was an injustice that this issue hadn't gotten more attention compared to like cycling, for example, because about 10 times as many people are killed walking every year in the United States as people biking.
So tell me a little bit about like your background in terms of how'd you get interested in this stuff in the first place, kind of in this urbanist space, transportation issues. I believe you wrote, or at least for a while, for the Plain Dealer, perhaps, or have had some stuff published there. No, but Streets Blog, I think, is where you really made a name for yourself with that, and where I first found you and started following you, and then your Twitter, you put out great content information on there. But what led to you, becoming passionate about this?
Yeah, so I used to be a newspaper reporter in different places across the state of Ohio. I didn't work for the Plain Dealer, but I did work for Toledo Blade. Actually, I kind of skipped around a little bit. So I reported on suburbs in Columbus. Then I went out to Youngstown. I was reporting on like urban affairs issues in Youngstown, which was really interesting. And then I was back covering the suburbs in Toledo. And just like the inequality in Ohio between suburbs and central cities, especially when I was doing it like 12 years ago, was really upsetting, right? And I started noticing, because I was covering planning, how different public policies sort of played into that. So I went back to school for urban planning. I got a master's degree in urban planning up here in Cleveland. And from there, that's when I started working at Streets Blog. So I worked for them for about 9 years before I just left about a year ago to finish this book. And recently I launched a consultancy around pedestrian safety as well. So that's sort of my next venture.
So basically, I think what you were touching on a little bit before the break, you were talking about, a lot of what's out there in terms of the research, in terms of like urbanist and transportation Twitter is more focused on public transit, and cycling and those types of things, and not so much on the pedestrian issues. How'd you get focused on that?
So actually so I have two kids, they're 3 and 5, but they're upstairs. When I had my first child, I used to do more biking, but you actually can't bike with a baby, until they're about 9 months. So I was just like, whoa, I can't bike anymore. And I started, people were like, once you have kids, you have to get a car. And I was sort of like, no, I'm not going to do that. So instead, I just started doing a lot of my trips by walking. And I set up everything. I set up the daycare and the doctor so that they were right nearby. So that did change my perspective a little bit. Just doing a lot more trips by walking.
Right, right. And so let's kind of move forward a little bit and get into the nuts and bolts of the book a little bit. So not only is this about pedestrian safety, we know what the statistics are. They're nationally, and here in Cincinnati, where I'm at, and I'm not sure if Cleveland's exactly the same, but we've seen these numbers where from 2010 to here, 2018, 2019, we're looking at a 50% increase in pedestrian crashes. The fatality rate has gone up. In other words, the crashes have gotten worse, which tends to indicate higher speeds. And also we get into the vehicle design, which is probably even a tougher nut to crack because you don't have any local control over that. But here in Cincinnati, I don't know if you've studied us specifically at all, but we certainly saw what we've seen across the country, where the interstate highways were purposely just rammed right through African American communities in the 60s, displacing folks, almost being like a physical redlining, that type of thing. And then also, the street design then we're connecting with like thoroughfare connectors where we're taking old urban narrow streets and widening them to 6 and 7 lanes wide. I've seen some of the old Cincinnati Enquirer articles from back at the time where they call it the improvements, these great improvements, because we're making it and you can just race right through and it'll be great. And then meanwhile, we see the outcomes in those neighborhoods are typically low percentage of car ownership. People are walking, biking, these types of things, and tend to have like zero political clout. And so when all of these things are impacted upon a neighborhood, we're still seeing the outcomes today, in a disparate way. And I always point to the irony that we tend to name a lot of times these boulevards super wide, and we name them after Martin Luther King, the civil rights icon. And meanwhile, the civil rights of the people there are being violated because they cannot safely move about, so we can have streets and people can race through to get home out to the suburbs or wherever. Does that pretty much sum it up in a nutshell of what we see?
I'm not as familiar with Cincinnati. And actually our MLK in Cleveland is not too bad. But yeah, there are definitely on some of the east side neighborhoods were real segregated in Cleveland, east versus west side. And some of the east side neighborhoods do have these really wide arterial roads where people drive very fast. And I was just talking with someone about how it seems to be sort of about speeding commuters to the Cleveland Clinic. So it does create a really dangerous situation in a lot of places.
What can you share just some of the key points or maybe information that you found in doing your research for the book that you found? Like you mentioned, for example, Roosevelt Avenue is kind of an example, like a worst case scenario, but we see it in other places. What is there anything that you found in researching the book that maybe you didn't even know or was really kind of surprising or shocking to you?
Yeah, definitely. I'm still learning stuff about this that does surprise me. I was telling someone this morning, I just saw this report that was about, it was done by LA Metro, and it was about why women and girls, barriers to transit ridership for women and girls. And one of the top complaints was they were being passed up at bus stops at nighttime in the dark. And it got me thinking about wow, I hadn't even thought of that people are standing at bus stops that don't have proper light, in the dark. And I think that issue of street lighting is a big issue that's been sort of overlooked in planning. And you've talked a lot about urbanist discussions. And I think some of this stuff comes back to privilege, right? So certain people, people who have a little more money, people who have a little more influence, a lot of times are not living in neighborhoods where there isn't adequate street lighting, right? Or if they are, they're not doing walking at night. But that's sort of not the case for everyone. And I think that's sort of an example of why some of this stuff has been overlooked.
Can you share with us a little bit about one of the things I was looking at here is that you have a chapter on victim blaming. That's one of the things that we commonly hear about. The first question they ask when there's a pedestrian hit: were they in a crosswalk? Did they make eye contact? Were they wearing bright colors? What did you find around that and just this perception? My sense is that a lot of this is, happened over the years with kind of the car company, like Follow the Money, right? And has been marketing to make us all believe that we're in the way of the cars. We need to get out of the way of the cars, and the cars need to be able to go.
Yeah. So pedestrian rights in the United States have really been reduced pretty significantly since cars entered the scene. There's a guy named Peter Norton that wrote a really good book about it, and it's sort of famous now about how these car companies and auto interests sort of invented this idea of jaywalking in the 20s and 30s, and that has really taken hold. And now pedestrians are sort of only permitted in roads at this very specific location, and even then, only when they have the light, right? And I think in theory, it would work okay if there was enough crosswalks everywhere and that the lights were timed correctly so that people of all ages and abilities had enough time to get across. But that's really not the case. They're oftentimes very far apart or not in the right places, and it puts people in a dangerous situation. So I think that whole notion is really due for a radical rethinking. There's this guy I write about in the book, Jorge Canes, who's he's a big pedestrian advocate in in Mexico City. He lives in Mexico City, and he dresses up in a lucha libre costume, like a Mexican pro wrestling costume, and he does these it's sort of like performance art in the streets of Mexico City, trying to remind people to be careful for pedestrians. And I was talking to him recently, and he said people are always asking him, what's the responsibility of a pedestrian in this situation? And he said the pedestrian's responsibility is just to walk. He said he thinks pedestrians should be able to cross the road wherever they want. And it's sort of a good point. In a lot of it sounds really radical here in the United States, but in a lot of the countries in Europe that have the best traffic safety records, there is no law against pedestrians crossing the street sort of wherever they want. Or there may be a recommended spot for them to cross, but they would never be stopped by the police and beat up or arrested like we see repeatedly in the United States for the offense of jaywalking. And it's sort of interesting. I get really into the weeds in it in the book, but in some places the law itself is a huge problem. In Florida, there was some really good investigative reporting about this in Jacksonville, and they found that there was 27 laws on the books in Florida about how people could walk. So pretty much anyone walking any distance would fall afoul of these laws. It would be nearly impossible to walk any distance in Florida without breaking one of these rules. And it becomes sort of this pretext for stopping and frisking people of color for a lot of police departments, jaywalking laws.
Right. And, if you picture some of the old photographs that we see of cities, it could be New York City or really anywhere from back in, maybe the 20s. And, as everybody's dressed up in their suits and their dresses and their top hats and all that, and they're just kind of milling about, walking in the streets. And you'll have a streetcar over here and maybe a buggy over here and a Model T over here, but people kind of walking. And we actually had in downtown Cincinnati, they would raise a flag on Fountain Square, which is equivalent to Cleveland Public Square, if there was a pedestrian hit and killed. And they raised so everybody was aware that this bad thing took place. But at some point, and you mentioned even the auto industry and putting money behind, coming up with this idea of jaywalking, which at the time a jay was a rube or a dumb person. Yeah. So that was the terminology. And they managed to just flip that, kind of upside down in our mentality. And then it just comes to be where the people in cars expect to be able to just go and everybody should be out of the way. But I sense the wind's starting to shift on that a little bit, and we're seeing that especially in these COVID times, where some cities are doing the street dining areas and different things. So we're taking back some of that real estate, some of that public space. Is that what you're seeing across the country?
Yeah, people have been asking me a lot about this. So the book was completed before any of this Corona stuff was really in the news in a big way in the United States. So that's not in the book at all. I don't know. I'm sort of of two minds about that. Like, I do think it makes a lot of sense to repurpose some of our street space, and it's nice that they were able to help these businesses, especially these restaurants, through this difficult period. But also, one of the things I talk about in the book is how there really hasn't been like a very equitable distribution of these safe street resources. Like, we have seen a lot more attention on walkability and biking in the last decade, but a lot of times it's only been sort of in the wider, more privileged neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason that the safety outcomes have eroded over the same period where there's been so much excitement about it.
Right. And obviously that's a big focus on the book, right? Or of the book, race, class, and the silent epidemic. Can you touch on that a little bit more? What is the data? What does the data show? And also, because not everybody lives in the city. And so now we're seeing some of these things in the suburbs, and you write about that, especially in the South, where the cities really grew after the car age, unlike the more historic cities where we're at.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I think that pedestrian deaths have been increasing so much is because of different demographic trends that are taking place across the United States. And some of them are sort of long running, like migration to the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt region is the most dangerous place for pedestrians in the United States. And that does have to do with when it sort of grew and came of age. It was right at the height of the sprawl era and the highway era. So places like Florida's the most dangerous state, or like Arizona. If you've been and you visited, you probably noticed like the roads are just really wide and really scary, even if you're driving. So those places have seen so much growth. And in addition, there's been this suburbanization of poverty that's been talked about a little, but I do think it's been a little overlooked. I like to, when I do a presentation, use these maps that show racial change in cities across the country. If you look at them, actually they were produced by the University of Cincinnati. They do these nice dot maps and they're green and yellow. It really is remarkable, like how much demographic change has occurred in the suburbs around the country. Like, one of the examples I use is Atlanta. And so the two northern suburban counties in Atlanta, Cobb and Gwinnett County, they were originally sort of settled by people who were outright segregationists, like in the 60s. So they would have been almost entirely white. And they all have, now they have about 1 million people in each county. So there's about 2 million people living in these counties now. That has changed so much now that both counties are either majority people of color or close to it at this point. So there's really been, especially in some of these growing metro areas, really big change in the suburbs. And there's been racial change, but there's also been more economic diversity in the suburbs. So more people that depend on walking or may depend on transit are finding themselves out in these areas that really weren't designed for walking. And the street infrastructure and sort of the design of the community hasn't changed to reflect, the demographic changes that are taking place.
Right. And I just want a little programming note here. If anybody has a question or a comment, I will keep an eye on those. My friend Bill Collins here is a very active community guy and civic leader here in the Madisonville neighborhood in Cincinnati, and also a student of history, I might add. Mentions that the city of Cincinnati itself is not proactive in advancing pedestrian safety innovations. So the only time we get this is when specific neighborhoods, which tend to be more affluent, lobby for safety. Or we have a scenario like what we had today on the second anniversary of the death of Gabby Rodriguez, where there's some incident that for some reason is so noteworthy that things are just kind of let's go out and do some stuff here, but it's kind of a one-off or a band-aid approach. Or we see, for example, we don't see a lot of on-street bike infrastructure here. We'll build trails for $1 million a mile or whatever it is. And once again, it tends to be in the more affluent neighborhoods. Other than, just the typical, political pressure and advocacy, what's the prescription? I mean, is there an answer? Is there an answer for any of this? If we know what the problem is, like, what do we do about it?
Yeah, people keep asking me this, and I think some people kind of hope that there'll be like a design solution. Like I could offer a design solution that would just sort of be sort of like a silver bullet. And I don't really think there is one. I mean, there are some design solutions like just retiming traffic signals. In New York, they've had a lot of success with that. They use what's called a leading pedestrian interval. So they set the walk signal so that the pedestrian gets a little bit of a head start on traffic, because those turning motions, especially left turns, can be really dangerous. And there's other things that I like pedestrian islands, adding pedestrian islands, which can be added for a few $1,000s, that let people make a crossing in 2 stages and have a little refuge there at the middle. I would love to see more of those. But I also think the first thing we need is sort of just like a change in mindset about this. And that's sort of what I'm hoping a little bit to accomplish with the book. Just to recognize sort of that there's systemic causes to these and that they are preventable, because a lot of this stuff, like I mentioned, the pedestrian islands or like retiming traffic signals, they're really not very expensive compared to a lot of this stuff we fund infrastructure wise. There just hasn't been attention to it. Nobody probably in Cincinnati. I guess if you guys have Vision Zero now, there might be someone looking at this. But probably nobody's like walking, in a position of authority, walking the most dangerous roads, trying to figure out like, what can we change here? How can we do this? There is some evolution happening in the industry, in engineering and in planning. And I do notice some changes that are just becoming part of the formula, but there's still a lot of work to do to repair like the existing roads that have so many missing pieces.
Right. Right, and you made, and we've got a couple of great comments and questions I want to touch on here. But you made an interesting point about the gentleman in his wrestling attire in Mexico City, kind of out there being this kind of character, but making a big point. And he goes like he's Superman, stopping cars.
It's so brilliant. That guy's a hero.
Yeah, and so part of that's like a cultural issue as well. And so, the last, and so we're talking about, African American neighborhoods and the impacts there. And you touched on women a little bit and some of their sense of safety, but also into Latin America, which I've always had a deep appreciation for Latin culture. And the last 3 winters I've lived in the country of Colombia. And have spent a lot of time, mostly in Medellin, but also Bogota, and seeing some, and not only there, but even in smaller towns where you see this, these treatments that are kind of almost would be radical here. We have to like test it out, do a pilot project. Yeah. It's a small town in Central or South America. They just do this stuff. But there's much more of a cultural, awareness, and people just honestly just walk more. But one of the big things that I saw there, other than like thousands of miles of on-street bike lanes or some random like side neighborhood streets have, separated bike lanes, were the raised crosswalks, which I thought were like a genius in their simplicity, in that this notion of, especially from just like an equity standpoint, we think about it. For ADA, we ramp the sidewalks down to the street, but it's still the pedestrian or the person that's rolling that has to change their altitude And so that's not how it is. It's a speed
Yeah.
table built into the crosswalk, and it's painted a bright blue or something. And so you're actually slowing down cars exactly where you need it. And it's just typical that you would see that. And I'm like, it's simple, but it's amazing. And yet we don't see stuff like that anywhere here.
Yeah, they do use it. They do use some of those in some parts of the United States, but not. Yeah, I think you're right that in Ohio they don't. Like in Cleveland, they don't want to do it. People have asked for it a lot of times, and like Public Works will just say, "Oh, well, that'll make it a little harder for snow plows, so we're not going to do that." It's like, who cares? Like, I mean, I'm sure that these snow plow guys will get the hang of it. Is it really? That's sort of like. I think it sort of goes back to like any excuse will suffice if you're not really interested in doing it. If you're just trying to brush off the people that care about this. I mean, I don't mean to be too dismissive. There are like sometimes fire departments will complain about them and people worry about how it will affect response times for them. But all that stuff is really kind of manageable if municipalities are motivated to do it. The problem is we're just not in Ohio, I don't think.
Right. And a lot of it at the end of the day just comes down to the political will to do these things and have an open mind. We know our traffic engineers are trained in traffic engineer school.
Yeah.
The level of service is the end all be all. It's all about, a street is an A+ street if it moves the most cars in the most volume. But what we're hearing, like at least here, really grassroots kind of level in the neighborhood, and even in neighborhoods that maybe tend to be a little more conservative or what you would think are a little bit more car oriented, they're saying, you know what? If a suburbanite has their commute slowed down by a few minutes, good. We want them, and there's data also right around saying if you go slow, now I see that I never saw that little coffee shop there. Now I'm going slow, so I see it, and I want to stop and go in there. And so these types of treatments oftentimes help our local small businesses and have other positive outcomes. But yeah. I think at least here that it's like the people in the neighborhoods, and you mentioned it, the folks are begging for this, but yet there's this reluctance, like this internal just inertia that we've always done it that way, and that's how we do it, and we don't want it. And we quote some regulation that's probably not a regulation, it's a guideline, but we're going to call it that and make you go away.
Yeah, I know. It is disappointing. And I think like in Ohio, I don't know, I think it's tough in Ohio. Changes are just tough in Ohio. I don't know why that is. I think like we have a lot of, I don't know why it is exactly, but yeah, it is sort of tough. It's really tough. I know that people here who've worked on bike stuff have really fought for minor changes, and it's a shame because I feel like we never, because we're not willing to experiment and try new things and change, we end up like on the back end of all the innovations that are happening, and it hurts our competitiveness, and it's just disappointing.
No, I think that's a valid point, and that people, it seems like there's a hue and cry out there for more walkable neighborhoods. Kind of going back to how our cities were designed. I want to be able to push the baby stroller down to the coffee shop, or have my kid get to school without getting run down and killed. And those are the types of things we want today. So. Let me get to a question here. Anti-Robust on Twitter asks, thoughts on automated camera enforcement. You and I, before we came on, we were talking a little bit about this. We actually have in Cincinnati about 15 years ago passed a city charter amendment outlawing any type of camera enforcement. What are your findings of the data and the effectiveness of it? Because you're always going to have somebody, it's a cash grab. You're just doing it to, make money or whatever. Is there data supporting? Are they effective? And maybe the difference of speed cameras versus red light cameras or some other type.
So, okay, yeah, people really hate them. It's like really difficult politically. but they work, like especially speed cameras. Like the data, I think that red light cameras are also justified, but for speed cameras, the evidence is even more compelling. And they're used a lot in New York City to pretty good effect. They use them in school zones. It's sort of sad because like here, ours was also outlawed by voters, and it wasn't close at all. But I think the city mismanaged the program a little bit here. I hate to say it, but it has to be managed very carefully. You have to make sure you're not concentrating cameras in lower income neighborhoods or black neighborhoods or brown neighborhoods, for one thing. You do have to be really careful about what's done with the revenue. Like one of the recommendations I've heard is don't use it for general revenues. Take all the money from the speed cameras and put it in a pool that's for safety. But actually, it's sad because that's what Akron was doing. Akron was only doing speed cameras in its school zones, and it was using all the money for road safety. And the state still kicked the legs out from under the program. So, and now we're having all these problems with police, trying to think of like different ways to do some of these duties that we've assigned to police, right? So it's sort of a shame that's off the table. But one thing I bring up in the book is like, we have a technology right now to speed limit cars, basically, right? So like we can prevent my car, like we got a new car a year ago and it came with a speed governor and my husband set it to like 10, I think it's set to 85. I forget, 10 above, whatever the fastest is what he set it for. So that's already widely available in cars. We could be controlling speed that way, and then people wouldn't have to deal with the fines. But for some reason, there's like, I think that it's sad, but like culturally, we've got a lot of work to do culturally, because I think there's like sort of an entitlement to speeding now. Like people don't think speeding is really very harmful. But it is. Like speeding related deaths in the United States are about 10,000 a year, according to the CDC. And that's about the same as drunk driving. So about as many people are killed in speeding related crashes in the US as drunk driving. But it hasn't been stigmatized in the same sort of way. Like officially, we sort of wink at it. And even for police, even the police enforcement, there's been pressure, and police are not doing as much speeding enforcement, even in highway like locations where there's a high number of deaths, like Texas, anymore. So it's tricky. It's tricky politically. I wish we would take advantage of some of this technology that would eliminate the need for like in-person interactions with armed officers, or even in the case of speed cameras, like tickets, which sometimes can be really financially painful for people.
Right. And so that's what you see in the Vision Zero model, right? Is that it's engineering, it's all of these, it's all of the E's, it's engineering, it's enforcement, but also an educational campaign around that. In other words, we're not trying to trick anybody, like your highway, for those watching that don't know, I was a police officer for 26 years, retired in 2016. And so, there's the old joke is, I'll set my portable bush out, and hide behind it. No, we're not trying to trick anybody. We're telling you, look, the goal is, in my view, the goal would be 0 tickets, because that means everybody's driving like they're supposed to. But at this point, at least in our city here, it's the Wild West out there. There's minimal enforcement. Even so, we have 1,000 police officers for the city of Cincinnati and 3,000 lane miles of street. And obviously, they're busy with a lot of other stuff now. These COVID times and all the cross currents are going on. The shootings are up. All of these types of things, and so the traffic enforcement is just an afterthought. And even if it's not, you're just kind of limited. I always use the analogy of a garden hose. And so you set an officer out there to monitor traffic on a particular thoroughfare on a street that's like designed for speeding, so people naturally go fast. And so you're out there to artificially limit that. And you do while you're out there, because people see the police car and they slam on the brakes. But as soon as you take that away, it's like releasing that pinching the garden hose. The flow just comes right back to how it was before. So I think your point is well taken, that the data supports it. It's just the politics. And We kind of started talking about it here about a year ago. And it was interesting the pushback that I heard from folks that were like nominally like really progressive. And all of a sudden I'm hearing like super like AM talk radio talking points from them, against it. And my sense is that, people just say they in their mind, they can picture, getting the ticket. They don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, there's this kind of that self preservation thing. And I saw it in my career. We'd get called out to a neighborhood because of speeding complaints. And then you're there 5 minutes, you pull a car over, and it's the guy that called about the speeding complaints in his neighborhood. Now you're pulling him over because that's, and so it just happens. So I'm not sure what the answer is on that, but I think it speaks to the point that we really have to get the engineering right, because the enforcement is just, we just can't count on that because there's not that mindset like they have in Europe with that kind of thing.
Yeah, actually, I wrote in the book a little bit. So in Sweden, where a lot of people are trying to copy their ideas about traffic safety, and they were one of the big leaders, they actually said, the guy told me that they don't really consider enforcement part of Vision Zero, that a lot of things that U.S. cities do then call Vision Zero that they wouldn't even consider Vision Zero, and that they pretty much, it's all about road design for them.
Right. And I think it should be, of the E's, the engineering is the biggest one in my view, and the rest of it is just like kind of spinning your wheels with limited effectiveness. Just taking a look at some of the comments here. Some folks talking about the cameras and such like that. I don't know. We've been on for a while now. I love this conversation. I could talk about this stuff all night. There's so many different angles to it, but in respecting your time, especially after we had our false start at the beginning, are there any just one or 2 points, and had some folks saying, hey, can't wait to read the book, and those types of things. So we certainly want to encourage everyone to go ahead and order Angie's book and support her very work here. But any 1 or 2 tidbits you could leave us with, or just kind of points of interest or things we might not realize even if we're engaged on this topic.
Yeah, I guess I already touched on this, but one of the things that I think is and I've been saying over and over is, so like on a highway, right? You have everything you need to be safe when you're on an interstate, right? If you need a guardrail, there's a guardrail. You can just count on it. If you need a sign, if you need paint, reflective paint, it's all there, right? Everything you need to be safe is there on a highway. But on arterial roads and on regular roads that people are crossing in the United States, that's not the case at all. A lot of the pieces that you need to be safe are missing. Like, if you're a person that's walking in like suburban Rockford, Illinois, which is one place I wrote about in the book, and you rely on a wheelchair, for example, and you ride the bus, if the infrastructure isn't in place, the sidewalks aren't in place, the curb ramps aren't in place, the bus stops aren't in place, or like the street lights, it can create a dangerous situation. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to sort of fill in those gaps. And I think like it's probably sounds like an enormous undertaking, but compared to what we've done with the interstate highways, it would be a lot cheaper and a lot less. And I think it would improve quality of life a lot if more people had the options of letting their kids walk to school, for example, or doing more trips that way. And we could reduce the cost of these injury and fatality crashes is very high in itself. So it would be a better investment, I think, than some of this stuff that's about congestion. So I don't know if that's a very inspiring send-off, but I think that's what you take away.
It keeps my wheels spinning here because you make some great points. I mean, you think about the cost of this, the cost of police response. So, for example, there's a crash out on the interstate, and you see 7 police cars there, a bunch of trucks, all this stuff, and then the medical costs outcome of that, the cost of repairing cars these days. Cars are It's people getting, 8-year loans and, $600 a month car, $700 a month car payments. One crash like that, might have an overall price tag to society of, $100,000, $300,000. That those costs are rarely calculated, right?
Yeah, I mean, like hospitalization would be huge. Some people require long-term care, loss of life or loss of quality of life for years. It's very expensive. It's very expensive. It's sort of like penny wise and pound foolish to ignore this stuff.
Indeed. And just to your last point, here's a photo from the book. The grass near U.S. Route 2 in central Minnesota is on some tribal land. And let's see if I can do this mirror image here. Up, down, up, down. And so the people have actually created a sidewalk where there isn't one. And we still have neighborhoods here in the city of Cincinnati that don't have sidewalks. I mean, that's just like a basic thing. The kids walking to school are walking in the street because there's these streets were just never designed with sidewalks, and now they just don't have them. And as simple as that.
Really
crazy. I don't know if that was a question or me just going on a continued rant. But at any rate, let's go ahead and close it with that. There's a lot.
Thanks so much for having me, and to the people that tuned in, asked questions.
Absolutely, yeah. We've got a bunch of folks on here, and that's awesome. We got off to a little choppy start with.
I'm sorry about that.
It's all good. It's all good.
Times, okay.
Yeah. So everybody, go out and check out Angie's book, Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. Angie, keep up the great work. What do we got next coming up for you? We got another book in the works. You're doing some consulting work. So now if I need some consulting or planning done around these things.
Yeah, I want to come. I want to go. I want to travel around and do some pedestrian safety audits. So if anyone in Cincinnati, quite honestly, is interested in that, it's not a very expensive process, and I think it's a really good one. I think it's sort of a good way to start.
Well, let's. I want to get to work on that, and hopefully we can get you down here and do some good work. Because as we know today here in Cincinnati, the second anniversary of the death of Gabby Rodriguez. Unfortunately, we've had others since then, and it's just a sad thing, and it's unfortunately a gift that keeps on giving. So. Angie, thank you for joining us this evening. Everybody, follow her on Twitter. How do we get a hold of you? How do we follow your social media? Because your Twitter's amazing. Let me just say that.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. My handle is Shmangie. It's really embarrassing. SCMGE. My business is 3mphplanning.com.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much. And everybody, thank you again for joining us this evening. Be safe and have a great night. Thanks, Angie.